On the night of December 15, 1900, a relief vessel named the Hesperus arrived at a remote lighthouse on Eilean Moor, a tiny island in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. The captain had been trying to reach the island for days, held back by violent seas and relentless rain. When the weather finally broke and the Hesperus approached the landing platform, the crew noticed something wrong immediately. The lighthouse beam, which had been dark for 11 days, was still not burning. No signal fire greeted them on the landing platform. The captain sounded the ship's horn. No one came to the cliff edge. He sounded it again. Nothing. A third time. Only the wind answered. The relief keeper, a man named Joseph Moore, was rowed ashore in a small boat. He climbed the stone steps cut into the cliff face, each step slick with sea spray, gripping the rusted iron handrail as the wind tore at his coat. At the top, he reached the entrance gate. It was closed, but not locked. He pushed it open and called out into the compound. His voice echoed off the stone walls and came back to him unanswered. The main door to the living quarters was also closed, but not locked. He stepped inside. The clock on the wall had stopped. The ashes in the fireplace were cold, days old, undisturbed. 2 of the 3 oilskin coats were missing from their hooks by the door, but one still hung there, dry and untouched, as if its owner had simply decided he did not need it. A chair lay overturned near the kitchen table, as though someone had stood up too fast, too suddenly, and had not bothered to right it. And on that table sat a meal, half prepared, the food cold and untouched, abandoned in the middle of an ordinary act that would never be completed. 3 men had been stationed on this island. Joseph Moore searched every room, every corridor, every storage space in the lighthouse. He climbed to the lamp room at the top of the tower. He checked the foghorn platform. He walked the entire perimeter of the island, calling their names into the Atlantic wind until his throat was raw. Not one of the 3 men was ever found. Not that day. Not in the weeks of organized searching that followed. Not in 125 years since. Welcome to the sinister past, where the real stories buried in history are far more terrifying than anything fiction could ever invent. The 3 men who vanished from the Flannan Isles lighthouse were not amateurs, and they were not strangers to danger. James Ducat was the principal keeper, a veteran of 20 years in the Northern Lighthouse Board, known throughout the service for his calm temperament, his meticulous record-keeping, and his absolute adherence to protocol. In 2 decades of service, he had never received a single reprimand. He was the kind of man other keepers wanted to work with, because if something went wrong at sea or on a remote island, Ducat would know what to do. Thomas Marshall was the assistant keeper, a younger man but already seasoned by several years of postings on Scotland's most isolated rocks, where the nearest human contact was a supply boat that came once a fortnight if the weather allowed it. Marshall was known for being observant and literate, the kind of keeper who kept detailed logs not because he was required to, but because he paid attention to the world around him. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, a local man from the Isle of Lewis brought in as a temporary replacement. MacArthur had spent most of his adult life working the fishing boats of the Outer Hebrides in conditions that would make most sailors refuse to leave port. His neighbors described him as unshakable. These were men who had been shaped by the North Atlantic, men who understood its moods, its sudden violence, its capacity for betrayal without warning. They had survived storms that could tear a fishing vessel apart in minutes. And yet, all 3 of them left a locked, fortified lighthouse in the middle of December during what appears to have been catastrophic weather, and walked out into the darkness. Not one of them ever came back. The last entry in the lighthouse log was written by Thomas Marshall on December 15th, and the final days recorded in that log tell a story that is almost impossible to read without feeling something cold settle in the pit of your stomach. On December 12th, Marshall wrote that severe winds had struck the island, worse than anything he had experienced in all his years of lighthouse service. He noted that the seas were lashing the western cliff face with extraordinary violence, sending spray higher than he had ever seen it reach. Then he added something that did not belong in a routine weather log. He wrote that James Duckett, the principal keeper, the calmest man in the Northern Lighthouse Board, had become unusually quiet, and that Donald MacArthur, the tough, seasoned mariner who had spent 30 years on the North Atlantic without flinching, had been crying, not upset, not anxious, crying. On December 13th, Marshall recorded that the storm was continuing with undiminished force. Then came a line that has chilled every researcher who has ever read this case. All three men, Marshall wrote, had been praying together. Stop and think about what that means. These were not fragile men. These were not men prone to emotional displays or superstition. These were lighthouse keepers who had chosen to live on a rock in the middle of the ocean precisely because they could handle what that meant. Whatever was happening on Island Moor between December 12th and 13th had shattered every layer of professional composure, every defense mechanism, every hard-won stoicism that these three men possessed. The entry for December 14th was brief, almost eerily so. The storm had ended. The weather was calm. That was all. December 15th, the day the Hesperus arrived to find them gone, had no entry at all. The log simply stopped as if the hand holding the pen had been pulled away mid-thought. But here is where the mystery crosses the line from strange into deeply disturbing, and where the physical evidence starts to tell a story that no official report has ever been able to reconcile with a comfortable explanation. When the investigation team from the Northern Lighthouse Board arrived on December 26th, they conducted a meticulous inspection of the entire island. Inside the lighthouse, everything was in perfect working order. The lamps had been cleaned, the wicks had been freshly trimmed, the oil reservoirs were completely full. Every duty that a professional keeper was required to perform had been performed with precision, right up until the final moment. There was no sign of illness, no sign of madness, no sign of conflict between the men. The provisions were fully stocked and untouched. Whatever drove these men out of the lighthouse, it was not hunger, disease, or violence among themselves. Outside, however, the western landing platform presented a scene of devastation that investigators struggled to explain. The iron railings that lined the cliff edge, railings that had been bolted directly into solid volcanic rock with industrial-grade fastenings, were bent and twisted outward, as though gripped and wrenched by something of enormous, almost unimaginable force. A concrete block, used to secure mooring ropes estimated to weigh well over a ton, had been torn from its position and hurled to a higher elevation on the cliff, as if it weighed nothing. A heavy storage crate that held ropes and maritime equipment had been ripped apart, its contents scattered across the rocks in every direction. Turf and earth from the top of the cliff, more than 200 feet above sea level, had been stripped away cleanly, peeled back as if by a giant hand running its fingers along the surface of the island. The damage was concentrated entirely on the western side, the side that faces the open Atlantic, with nothing between it and the coast of Newfoundland, 3,000 miles away. The eastern side of the island, by contrast, was completely untouched, calm, pristine, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. So the question that has consumed investigators, historians, and maritime experts for over a century is brutally simple. If the weather on the western cliff was powerful enough to bend iron railings bolted into volcanic rock, to displace a 1-ton concrete block, and to strip turf from a cliff top 200 feet above the waterline, then why would 3 experienced lighthouse keepers leave the safety of a locked stone tower and walk directly into it? 2 of them did not even stop to put on their waterproof coats. In December, in the Outer Hebrides, in the teeth of something that was rearranging the physical landscape of the island. The official report, written by Robert Muirhead, superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, concluded that the 3 men had most likely gone to the western platform to secure equipment during the storm and had been swept away by a sudden massive wave. It was the simplest explanation available. It was the most rational. And almost no one who has studied the case in the 125 years since believes it fully accounts for what happened. The theory requires all 3 keepers to have been outside the lighthouse simultaneously, and that directly violates the standing orders of the Northern Lighthouse Board, orders that were not suggestions but ironclad regulations. At least 1 keeper was required to remain inside the lighthouse at all times, under all circumstances, no matter what was happening outside. James Ducat had enforced those rules for 20 years. He had built his career on them. He would not have broken them without a reason so compelling that it overrode everything he knew about duty and survival. There have been other theories, and not one of them is comfortable. Some researchers have proposed a rogue wave, a rare but documented oceanic phenomenon in which the sea produces a single wave of extraordinary, freakish height, sometimes exceeding 30 meters, far larger than any wave around it, appearing from what seems like nowhere and vanishing just as quickly. A rogue wave striking the western cliff at precisely the right angle could potentially explain the physical damage on the platform, and could have caught the men before they had any chance to retreat. But even this theory buckles under the weight of the details. It still requires all 3 men to have already been outside, together, when the wave struck. It does not explain why MacArthur's oilskin coat was still hanging on its hook, dry and undisturbed, because no man who has spent his life at sea walks into a North Atlantic winter storm without his waterproof coat. You do not forget it. You do not leave it behind. Unless you are running from something that gave you no time to reach for it. And it does not explain the log entries. The weather stations on Lewis, the nearest inhabited island just 20 miles to the east, recorded moderate conditions on December 12th and 13th, nothing remotely close to the apocalyptic gales Thomas Marshall described. Either Marshall was fabricating his entries, which no one who knew him believed for a moment, or the weather on Island Moor was radically, impossibly different from everywhere around it. The island is exposed, certainly, more exposed than most, but it is not so uniquely positioned that it would experience world-ending storms while its nearest neighbor enjoyed mild winds and calm seas. Something does not add up. Something has never added up. And no theory yet proposed has made it add up. And then there is the detail that haunts this case more than any iron railing or displaced boulder: the crying. Donald MacArthur, a man forged by 30 years on the North Atlantic, a man whose neighbors called unshakable, a man who went to sea in weather that kept other fishermen indoors, was weeping. Not on the night of the disappearance, days before it. On December 12th, when whatever was happening on that island first began. What did he see? What did he hear? What did he feel pressing against the walls of that lighthouse that broke a man like that so completely? The log does not say. Thomas Marshall simply recorded the fact and moved on. as though he himself did not know how to explain it or perhaps did not want to. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was automated in 1971. No keeper has lived on Eilean Moor since. The light still burns every night, sweeping the Atlantic in steady, mechanical silence, requiring no human hand to tend it and no human voice to fill its rooms. Fishermen who pass the island after dark say the beam works perfectly. It always has. The lighthouse was never the problem. Whatever happened on that island in December 1900 happened to the men, not to the machine, and the island has kept its secret for 125 years without the slightest indication that it intends to give it up. The official file remains open. No bodies were ever recovered. No definitive cause of death was ever established. Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur simply ceased to exist on a windswept rock in the North Atlantic, leaving behind a stopped clock, an overturned chair, a cold meal that no one would ever finish, a coat that no one came back for, and a question that refuses, no matter how many years pass, to die. What happened on Eilean Moor? We do not know. We may never know. But whatever it was powerful enough to make 3 brave men abandon everything they understood about safety and survival, walk out into the howling dark without their coats, and vanish from the face of the earth as though they had never existed at all. Next time on the Sinister Past, we travel to the mountains of 16th century Hungary, where a countess of extraordinary wealth and terrifying power stands accused of a crime almost too monstrous to comprehend. Hundreds of young women entered her castle over the course of 2 decades. Not one of them was ever seen again. The servants whispered of screams echoing through the stone corridors long after midnight, of chambers hidden behind locked doors where the walls were stained dark with something no one dared name, of a woman who believed that bathing in the blood of young girls would keep her beautiful forever. Was Elizabeth Bathory the most prolific female serial killer in all of recorded history, or was she the victim of a vast political conspiracy engineered by powerful men to seize her estates and destroy her name? The evidence is as disturbing as the legend itself, and the truth depends entirely on which documents you are willing to trust and how much darkness you are prepared to look at directly. That story is next.